Extraordinary Sunday 25, and we've got a very unusual parable. We're probably used to it, but would have had a fair bit of startling impact when first we heard it 2,000 years ago, or a little less. Welcome to you, Peg. Welcome, Alec. Welcome, Bishop Kelvin. I'll give you a full title, and I believe you've got a little bit of background for us.
Well, this is indeed a passage which is baffling. It comes in Luke's Gospel after the great parables of finding lost things, lost coin, lost son, lost sheep, and got to be taken in that context. The bit that comes immediately before it is the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. And the prodigal son gives up his crazy ideas about how he's going to make a way in the world and comes to his senses and goes rushing back to his father. And the other parables are about those parables of loss are about the Father's willingness, the God's willingness to passionately seek after us. So you've got to imagine that this parable somehow fits in there. And yet what we've got this dishonest steward. And on the face of it, the most plausible reading is that this dishonest man not only continues in his dishonesty, but he encourages others to be dishonest, and his master praises him for that, which seems to cut right across what's gone before. But I think there's a bigger context to be taken too, and that's the whole context of the theme of money in the Bible. Now, in the Bible, there are 6 verses about homosexuality. There are more than 2,000 about money. And what does the church get divided over? These 2,000 verses about money, we quietly ignore. And it's not as though that they are ambiguous. Those 2,000 verses about money all speak with the same voice, saying pretty much the same thing, is that money has got to be put into the service of the gospel and for the service of those amongst us who are the most poor and the most vulnerable. So you've got to expect that somehow this parable is going to fit into that as well, that whole overarching view of money. And so what we've got here is a monetary system which is actually fairly corrupt. The Bible speaks with a strong voice about money, and rich people were very uncomfortable with it, as they are today. And so what they would do was that they would not handle this corrupt substance, money. They would have a steward to do it for them. So the steward would get his hands dirty dealing with money, and the rich man could keep up his pretense at piety. And so we've got this corrupt monetary system, and a steward in the middle who's equally corrupt. I mean, he's pocketing money left, right, and centre. And then he's found out and sacked. So what does he do? Well, it seems that in this parable, he steps right out of the monetary system and goes to a more biblical system. And that is, he takes all of the people aside and sets things up according to their need and according to their ability to pay, rather than extracting everything that he could from them. And what we've got to expect is that he is, the steward, is giving up more than the master. In fact, you could say it's probably a good guess that the portion he's remitting to the debtors is the portion that he would have pocketed himself. And so overall, you could see it as a parable of putting money in its proper context. And this is, at the end of the parable, Jesus sums all this up with that famous quote that people often quote but never practice for themselves. You can't serve 2 masters. Either you'll love one or the other, and you'll hate the other one, he says. And you can't serve God and mammon. And I think that this is a story which illustrates that saying.
Well, there you are, because I feel challenged in about 7 different directions here. But let's go to you, Alec, first of all, or second of all, really. But let's hear about where you find this personally confronting, challenging.
Well, obviously, I find it confronting and challenging because I don't understand a blind bit about what it's on about, and was encouraged that most of the commentators who I read frequently and like agreed with me. that in fact it was really difficult. But one of the things which I actually found interesting in the reading the commentators was a suggestion that what was remitted was the piece that had already been added on illegally, because you weren't allowed to charge interest on anything that you'd lent to some people. But apparently it was a common practice that when people had taken 80 bushels of wheat from you, you charged them for 100. So it wasn't actually interest, but it was actually, they were charged for stuff they didn't get. And that what this servant did was actually to just discount that back to what was actually owed to them. Now, no one can quite agree whether or not that's actually the truth, but I quite like it as a concept, and it helps me with trying to struggle with the reading in general.
Okay, so we've got what I'm going to call corruption and decorruption as a symbol of our priorities or something. Peg, for you, where do you find some challenge?
It was just baffling, and especially on the surface, to see that dishonesty gets rewarded, that not only gets rewarded, but gets praised as being shrewd, and not only gets praised, but saying that believers don't understand this. It's just challenging.
It is very challenging, and it's something in there about prioritizing. But Kelvin, for you personally, you're reading this?
Oh, well, it's a challenge for me to realize that I live in the top, 5% of the world's wealthy people. And wealth is as corrupting on me as it is on anybody else. And we have got all manner of ways of justifying that to ourselves. I was in Dunedin this morning and walking down George Street past 3 beggars in Dunedin. And, you know, our whole monetary system is falling to bits, and people at the bottom who can't get up. And that's the challenge for me. How do I have a gospel attitude and a gospel relationship with money?
All right, so a parable that operates at innumerable levels, innumerable challenges, but I'm feeling a bit crushed at the moment. Give me Peg, give me some good news.
Well, first the question is there anything redeemable about this parable? But there is. There's in this parable, Jesus reuses that how much more will God give idea. And so that even if this dishonest, corrupt manager can get praise and be seen to be seeing the right thing to do, how much more if we already grasp what God has given us and we share that wealth and do what is right and live as good stewards, how much more will we be given? That's got to be the good news. Yes, if this dishonest man can be rewarded, and if we do what God calls us to do and live in a world and heal the world and work towards the world, how much more will we be given?
This, but so much more. Kelvin, for you, still wanting to hear good news.
Well, the good news is that I don't think it's a terrible parable at all. And I don't think he's being rewarded for dishonesty. I think that he steps out of this corrupt system and finds something else, which is relationships. And for me, the good news is that here I am trapped by the wealth of the West. But Jesus says to me, there is a way out. There's a better way that you can live your life. And instead of putting money at the center, putting relationships at the center.
And in a world of considerable loneliness that we live in, even in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that's critical. For you, Alec?
Well, for me, I think the good news is that in this process, the person is given kudos and points for having thought outside the square and actually found another way of doing things. So not being approved of for being rotten and stealing. And I think it's incredibly good news that God is asking us to be outside the square, to be thinking on our feet, to be being able to work in a situation which is not straightforward and isn't simple, and to find the way through to what it is that God is asking of us in our society.
So this relationship, there's reprioritizing, I think. Let's talk about downtown wherever we live, the paddock, the city, the city block. what are the implications? What are the throes of this for us today? And let's go to you again, Alec, just to keep you on the hop.
Well, I mean, yeah. What am I going to change about my behavior or the way I act because of what I've read? I'm with most of the rest of people, Kelvin. I'm still trying to avoid the questions about wealth. God and I frequently talk about my money, which is not mine. And I still find it an incredibly difficult subject to deal with. I know that if I'm ever going to have a real relationship with God, it has to be where I can say, well, actually, I'm going to trust in you, not on what was on my Visa card at the present point in time. And I still, and that's the challenge for me still. And it's the thing which I consistently try to work with and fail, but I keep trying to figure out how it is that I get past that piece of having been brought up by well-meaning parents who lived through the Depression, who told me that I absolutely have to have money in the bank and I absolutely have to be made sure that I've got enough to get by on. How do I get past that and trust God? So that's the piece which I'm working on in my real life still.
Right, so I'm hearing something about God breaking into our kind of present situation, our existential situation of all its background.
Yeah.
I'm still challenged by that book I read years ago, and I've mentioned it before in this forum, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, and I find that title, just the title, very challenging. Peg, for you, let's have an application. So what?
I think it is going along both Kelvin and Alec's ideas, but it's about the relationships, about being Christian communities and seeing it in a different way to make this world work as God's vision has given us, that we, to fulfill God's purpose for our lives, we need to break out of the wealth and poor and reimagine how we live in a world that all are equal and all are taken care of and shared and take care of the world and the environment. And
I love that word, reimagine.
Thank you.
It's an important word in faith. So we're reimagining something. Kelvin, let's come to you to sort of wrap up and tell me.
Well, for me, the monetary system we're in is enormously complex, and we are caught in all manner of ways. I mean, people have mortgages, and you got to pay them, and you know all of that stuff. What's powerful for me is the whole sweep of this section of Luke's gospel, which is about God's passion for us and God's determination to lead us into freedom, no matter what is holding us, and no matter how complex or how daunting the systems might be. There's a way through, and God will lead us through it.
So the leadings of God, and also putting into context of the whole of Luke's great vision of a just and compassionate God. A tricky reading. Thanks for joining me on this one. It's one of the tough ones. But Peg, Alec, Kelvin, thanks for helping me break open the word. Thanks.